All right, so welcome back to part 2 of Science Day. So this morning, as many of you know, we had a youth leaders learning exchange, and this afternoon we'll be considering learning from collaboration with Indigenous peoples and local knowledge, case studies. And youth and Indigenous and local knowledge are 2 of the themes for this assembly, and the 3rd theme is women. But I don't want you to think STAP is ignoring women. We don't have a separate session on women, but 80% of the people you've been hearing from today will be women. So we feel like we're kind of covering this too. The topic of our discussion this afternoon will be how can collaboration with Indigenous and local knowledge help the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, to deliver greater global environmental benefits, or GEBs, which is the acronym we often slip back into. And why would we want this topic? Well, because that's what GEF's mandate is, to support countries in meeting their obligations under the various multilateral environmental agreements, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, on climate change, and we spoke this morning, as did the CEO, on the emerging conventions of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction and plastics. As I think most of this group probably already knows, Indigenous peoples manage or have tenure rights over about 40 million square kilometers of land in more than 90 countries. And that actually represents more than about 1/4 of the Earth's surface, and 40% of the terrestrial protected areas, and 80% of the remaining biodiversity is on land that is either managed or owned by Indigenous peoples. So in this session, as I say, we want to hear about collaborative projects where Indigenous and local knowledge has really helped to deliver global environmental benefits. We want to hear about lessons learned, best practices, trade-offs, etc., all with an eye towards giving guidance to the GEF in how it can do better in GEF 8 and GEF 9 to enhance global environmental benefits with Indigenous knowledge and peoples and local peoples. A couple of the questions that I think will sort of flow through the entire afternoon are going to be, first and foremost, what are the contributions to global environmental benefits from the Indigenous people, local communities? What are the barriers and the opportunities to this contribution, to increasing this contribution? How can it be expanded, scaled up quickly? We spoke this morning about how we desperately need transformational change to tackle all these environmental crises, but we need to tackle them simultaneously. So we got to be able to measure what is improving and why. And then what can the Global Environment Facility do to support the IPLCs in their stewardship of the land and waters which they own or manage? And so I'm hoping this afternoon our speakers will help to shed light on some of these issues, give guidance on what directions to follow. And we're very excited to start with another fabulous keynote address, as we did this morning, and this time from Eduardo Brandizio. Also, will not read his entire resume, or that will consume an hour, but he is a professor of anthropology. He directs the Center for the Analysis of Social Ecological Landscapes, and he's a senior fellow at the Ostrom Workshop in Political Theory and Policy Analysis at Indiana University in Bloomington. And I think it's been for over 3 decades now. Eduardo's work has documented, has examined, and has responded to the social environmental transformation and governance challenges, particularly in the Amazon. And he's examined the interactions among policy development, markets, climate change, household and community level use, and migration decisions. And he's also co-chaired, as many of you know, the Global Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, known as IPBES, which was approved by 132 countries in 2019. I could go on, but I should just say he was also just elected to the National Academy of Sciences last year. So it's a great pleasure to give you Eduardo Brandizio. And if we could pull up his slides.
afternoon. It's wonderful to be here. Such an honor to be here. Thank you, Rosina, for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. Before I start, I missed the very beginning of the discussion today where I think there was a land acknowledgement, but otherwise I want to do the land acknowledgement from where I work in the anthropology department at Indiana University, which honors the Miami, the Delaware, the Potawatomi, the Swanee people on whose ancestral lands and homelands and resources my university is on today. I'm not non-indigenous person. I've been working in Amazonia for about 35 years, most of the time on the ground, and that's the perspective, as well as in global related assessment, and that's the perspective that I want to bring it to you today. My approach here will be to take a look back on this relationship between indigenous peoples and local communities and GEF, and use that as a way to hopefully look forward, to confront the challenges that we have now in front of us that has been already so well discussed this morning and throughout this conference. I'm going to excuse for not presenting, I have some slides that have quite a bit of detail, but I'll not get into that level of detail. I hope that you capture the general arch of the story that I'm talking, so I excuse myself for passing through some of the slides in a way that we'll not be able to explore, and we can talk about that later, okay? I also want to say that, we are talking a lot of the points that I'm making at a large global international level, recognizing the diversity, and the multiple histories that we have when we talk about indigenous people and local communities and their relationship to a body like this. So I want to make this clarifications in advance. I want to start with three statements that I believe have become an agreement over these communities. The first agreement that we see and that has consolidated during the past 10 or so years, of course, with a much longer history, is the recognition of the role of indigenous people and local communities in global environmental governance. And I'll get in more detail to that. That is a huge step. When I start to work on this topic, and the inclusion of and participation of indigenous peoples in particular, but then progressively local communities, was considered important, but localized contributions. I heard that many times, in assessments where why to put so much emphasis on this, when we're talking about a local scale. That idea has now changed. I think there's an appreciation today, as we're going to see, and as I put in the title there, which is the title of a review paper, that these contributions are locally based, but they are manifested regionally, and they have a global relevance. And that's the first agreement that today we're sort of talking about that, and we're sort of coming to an agreement around this issue in this international community. The second thing that has become very clear and that you're going to see assessment after assessment, panels after panels, is that we haven't changed a bit business as usual development. If anything, those trajectories continue to develop the same way they have been for at least 50 years. This is the 50-year analysis that we did for the Global Assessment Report, which was published 2019. It is still up to date. If anything, the last 4 years has only seen an increasing discrepancy in development and an increasing, of course, pressure on the global environment. What these graphs show, more or less, is that global economic development hasn't changed much. And it has continued to concentrate wealth and to spread degradation and appropriation of labor and resources in a moving frontier that continues to move around. And that's why, in part, we're talking so much about indigenous people and local communities, because they've been at the forefront of these frontiers for decades and for centuries. I'll go back to this in a second. The third point that I want to make that has become an agreement, and this is from a document supported by GEF, is that we cannot meet whether the biodiversity or the climate agreement without explicitly recognizing the right holders and the decision makers that are indigenous people and local communities within these agreements. So we have these three areas that we basically now have a common understanding of the contributions, of the development problems that we have, and of the need for partnership if we want to meet any of these agreements by 2030 or forward. The problem here is that these three words are colliding. And they are colliding right in front, and right where indigenous people and local communities are conserving, protecting, and trying to keep the stewardship and the resources that we all depend on. And it's this collision that I want to talk about. So recognition on that importance has gained during the past decade in particular quite a bit of evidence. Today we know just a few years ago we did not have a global map of indigenous lands. This is greatly incomplete, but it was a significant advance that we now can talk about and do analysis to actually show what are the contributions, what are the distribution, where they play, and the significance of the population, of the demographics, of the cultural diversity that represents this group. Now we know and we can quantify, right, as Rosina just said, right, the actual surface managed held in rights by indigenous peoples, which is about 28% of the global surface, but is incomplete. If we consider customary lands as a proxy for local communities, and I'll get to this terminology in a second, that percentage goes to 32% of terrestrial lands over 132 countries. And on, you have, of course, the relevance to protected areas, the relevance to the most conserved areas in the planet, and the relevance for biodiversity priority areas. If you look at the conditions of these lands vis-a-vis everything surrounded, 65% of IPLC lands, mostly indigenous lands, have zero to low human modification, with 91% having moderate to good ecological conditions. So the statement that came before makes a lot of sense when we look into the actual distribution and contribution of indigenous peoples and local communities globally. The same is for the agreements and for the progress that we have been able to do during this past decade. When we look at the Arch targets, the 2011-2020 biodiversity goals, there's in general frustration with the advancement that has taken place, but a lot has progressed during that time. There's a lot of advances. And a lot of these advances coming in are from people working on the ground, indigenous peoples and local communities and many other civil groups that have been advancing that. So it has become very clear that this relationship, this partnership will define the agenda for the coming decades. But why a crossroads? A crossroads because these words are colliding. So on the one hand, just as Rosina just said, you have to accelerate implementation, but more than that, the bigger challenge is to find synergies between what we do in biodiversity, what we do in food systems, what we do in climate, what we do in pollution. So it's a huge undertaking to change this sectoral approach to a more integrated approach in such a short period of time. What is the other crossroads, and what is one of the key points that I want to make here? If we want and if we need the help, the support of indigenous peoples and local communities to achieve global environmental governance, we need to look the other way. We need to ask at the same level the question of what are the needs, the aspirations, and the threats that indigenous communities, in particular, and local communities across rural areas are facing everywhere. It has to be a two-way road for this to work. And we have to ask these hard questions, right, that are way beyond the environmental dimensions of these relationships. And here are some points that are important for us to consider and to bring to this conversation. 85% of indigenous people, and these are mostly for indigenous peoples, in fact, live in countries that have not ratified the '89 ILO Convention. 80% of the population live in lower middle-income countries or middle-income countries in areas that are already depressed by development and lack of services. You have the poorest of the poor, no matter what indicator you have. This is, rarely discussed about when we talk about indigenous people and local communities, but the actual economic security conditions that people face on the ground. They're much more likely to suffer from the problems that development causes, and indigenous women in particular. It's a world of informal jobs. 86% of informal jobs compared to non-indigenous peoples. And some of the highest rates of migration, particularly from the youth to urban areas. And I'll go back to this point in a second, because this is a key part of the conversation. Besides any other issues, I put pollution, exposure, and other problems that are disproportionately confronted by indigenous peoples and local communities. We need to bring these issues to the conversation if we want to leverage and partner with indigenous peoples and local communities in advancing global environmental agendas. And I'll give just some examples from sort of recent research. I mean, this is what colleagues in the Xingu Indigenous Reserve would call the unwanted hug. Things are closing in. Development is closing in. Degradation is closing in everywhere, right? And no matter how successful indigenous or local communities are in managing their territories, they're surrounded and overwhelmed by pressures. Similar for pollution. When we look at the pollution distribution, I put the case of mercury, but we did a broader analysis of pollution. And you see that pollution in indigenous areas are closely related in space. And more broadly, threats to indigenous and local knowledge systems, and how multidimensional they are. It's all sorts of pressures that the youth in indigenous areas and in rural areas are confronting to preserve, to value, to be honored with their knowledge in face of a society that usually disregards it, right? If not stigmatize it. So the point is that all these words are colliding, and we need to have a conversation about the conditions of indigenous populations on the ground and of local communities. This has been happening in some ways within GEF. When you look at the last, I collected evaluation works. They go back, to 2005. And you see progress. You see recognition of these issues, at least to the level of recognizing them as problems, if not programmatically or in terms of finance. But it shows a process of slow but incremental change. But the question is that enough? Is that enough at this particular crossroads to move forward. So let's look back a little bit into the evolution of this relationship. And I did this timeline in a very simplified way to get across some messages. So you're going to find a lot of things missing from there. But what you have on the top is, of course, the development of key international environmental, mostly governance issues that have evolved for the past 50 years. In parallel to that, and not necessarily connected to that, you have a long history of struggles, and in this case, particularly by indigenous people, but not only, that have in parallel, tried to and advance it on the rights, the organization, a place on the table, and a place on the discussion in these and other conventions and other agreements. So it's important to look that when we're talking today, and when indigenous people and local communities are here today, in organizations like this, they're building upon a long history of organization, an organization that goes way beyond environmental issues. And that network, that institutional memory, is an invaluable piece for global environmental governance. They bring to the table an international perspective and network and forms of collaboration that are really central for us to pursue together a better way for global environmental governance. Now, particularly after the 1990s and during the 1980s, a lot of this organization, many of the organizations, start to emerge in the context of global environmentalism. And that's the context in which, for instance, the terminology that we use today, IPLC, indigenous peoples and local communities, have evolved. It has evolved in the context of an alliance within global environmental discussions, in which, in spite of particularities, you have many common problems. And it was needed to join a common voice to get a space in global environmental discussion. So after 1991-92, you start to have this alliance emerging to what has become today, sort of the conventional IPLC. There are precedents to that have been very important. For instance, in the Amazon, for instance, you have the rubber tapper movements in Chico Mendes, right in the 1970s, who were at the forefront of confronting development and deforestation, and right after, became an important umbrella for indigenous peoples and all sorts of communities together to have a common voice of development. So you have, many precedents to that. Indigenous and local knowledge also has a very long history, a very fraught history in many ways, but it's a much older sort of idea than the general idea of IPLC. Right? You have over a century of utilitarian approach trying to understand and appropriate knowledge for economic botany purpose or for other purpose, right, that have been sort of shown the importance of indigenous and local knowledge in an utilitarian way. Over a century, this has changed dramatically, right, to a recognition that is not only utilitarian knowledge, but their values, their worldviews, their praxis, their management, their institutions that are part of knowledge systems that allow the stewardship of environment and production to develop. Anyhow, there's a long history here, and a history that parallels a much longer struggles by indigenous peoples and other organizations. And that's where the IPLC thing was. So this has been evolving. From the beginning of GEF, there are issues concerning the problems of uniting these two groups, indigenous peoples and local communities, a much broader definition. And from the beginning of GEF, there are issues that you cannot disregard the particularities of indigenous peoples or local communities, that these concepts should not and cannot be applied in a blanket way without attention to the place and the context in which you're using those terms. But there has been a lot of evolution in terms of that as well. When you look at the bottom part there, what I did was a summary of some of the main issues that were raised in 2005 in the first review of the engagement of GEF with IPLC. And one of the beginning quotes of that report was that there are serious problems. And there are a series of issues that have been raised at that time, like the focus on mitigation over prevention in the implementation of protected areas, for instance, seeing IPs only as beneficiaries and not partners in this process, and a lot of other problems that were raised that I don't have time to go now, that progressively, in some ways, have been addressed. The very evolution of conservation practices is part of that relationship. You look at the emphasis and you look at the reports from GEF from 20 years ago, it was a lot about protected areas and implementing protected areas no matter the cost. That has evolved progressively to a focus on sustainable use, different types of sustainable use, more recently community-based management, in more recent other kinds of conservation areas and so forth. So that evolution of how we think about conservation itself has been a product of this relationship and the intense participation of indigenous people and local communities with GEF. And there are many, and I did a summary, and I find interesting that just in the past 6 years or so, there has been 3 evaluations of that relationship. And it's interesting because you see significant progress compared to 2005, but you also see persisting issues and challenges that don't go away. And that it's interesting because they're highly complementary in terms of some of them focusing on the governance procedures of GEF, others focusing on problems on the ground and what needs to be addressed so that investment in projects and interventions become successful over time. So let me illustrate some of this process with very few and very brief Amazonic examples and where the problems are showing up now and where we could pay attention to or put efforts on going forward. We tend to think, and most people I think when we think about the Amazon, immediately we tend to think about the destructive forces of deforestation, mining, fires, and so forth, which is rightly so given the scope. What people don't tend not to think about is that the Amazon, it's full of initiatives. They're full of bright spots on the ground, led by communities, by indigenous communities, by rural communities of different kinds, by civil groups, in many kinds of partnerships that are throughout transforming the region from the bottom up, but colliding with the larger development forces that we're talking about. But it's important that we pay attention to those actions on the ground to try to understand what can help them actually scale up and create emergence change in larger landscapes. This is a map of one of our projects, the Agents projects, that we did through participatory approaches, an inventory of sustainability initiatives by indigenous groups, rural communities, and traditional communities. And we did, our database was about 200 types of initiatives implemented in over 900 localities in 140 and 84 municipalities. They're everywhere in the region. These are initiatives, many of which are supported by GEF in one way or another, that are changing production systems, that are doing innovative resource management, restoration, territorial governance, different kinds of organizations. And one of the most important things, value aggregation and market access for local communities to get the benefits of the work that they do on the ground. They evolved, well, the top part is not there. The top part is a map of deforestation in the region. And it basically mirrors the bottom map, which is when initiatives and place-based initiatives by indigenous peoples and local communities start to emerge. And what you see is that they start to emerge in reaction to the spread of deforestation, right? And you see a pattern there that has led those to emerge. When we look back and we look at different phases of support, including many phases from the Global Environmental Facility and other funders, we see a really interesting also development and evolution of the perspective of projects. We had, what we say, a syndrome of pilot projects from 1990 to well into 2000 that were only last while subsidies were there. Top down, sort of responding to the interests of others, that led to a lot of frustration, a lot of failures, a lot of problems on the ground. But what we see today is a really interesting process of learning. You see that the organizations that are showing the map and that are there today have learned from these failures, have built new kinds of alliances and new ways of dealing with the problems that they face. And these are, as I said, new techniques for restoration, for increasing production in sustainable ways, for spreading agroforestry systems, sustainable forestry management led by communities, and a variety of activities that are trying to harness the benefits right there where they are produced, meaning trying to do value aggregation to generate better income and jobs right at the local level. These are some of the most interesting initiatives that we see on the ground. So these are examples of non-timber forest products initiatives, timber-based forest management initiatives, agriculture and agroforestry systems, water-based initiatives for community-based fisheries or other kinds of turtle and other things. What did we learn from this very brief overview of this process of analyzing these hundreds of initiatives, which is, by the way, only the tip of the iceberg? There are thousands of such initiatives going on the ground. What have we learned by doing analysis, a comparative analysis across them, and what made them successful? And successful as defined by their own terms. Well, sort of what we know in many ways, but in this case, sort of supported by our empirical analysis. They are built and start from local knowledge and from the motivations and the needs that people define on the ground, not on the outside. They, in all cases, integrate not only focus on production or resource management, but governance in value aggregation activities and market access. That's a trademark on the evolution of these initiatives that were 20 years ago focusing on some kind of technical solution for improving management of production, to today initiatives that integrate the governance and the market aspect of that. Partnerships, and not only partnerships, but diverse partnerships at different levels. It's a key indicator to help predict the success of local enterprise. And the connection and formation of networks, as I'll mention in a second one. Organizations that are supra-local to help solve problems that are supra-local, such as logistics, transportation, monitoring, and other problems that are emerging. So these features, you see across initiatives that they help to advance, they lead to better outcomes. What are some of the problems that we see in the success of these initiatives? And here I'm only highlighting two for the sake of time. One is a mismatch of landscape governance. It's where they fit the unwanted hug that successful cases have, surrounded by all sorts of activities. And the other one is the mismatch between the economic benefits and the costs that they face in promoting those initiatives. Those two mismatches are key, I think, challenges for the coming years. This has become very common now to look at the Amazon and see what I would call islands of landscape governance. And that's part of that process that I said at the beginning, right? We haven't changed anything, even though we have improved indigenous recognition of IPOC, conservation, we haven't changed the pace and the type of development. That is what is happening today. You have islands of very successful governance, but they are single-level governance. And they cannot deal with the problems that are coming from the outside. It's way beyond the responsibility and the possibilities of local communities. This is the situation where we have today. And one thing that we need to bring to this picture is urban areas. The Amazon is being defined by the network of urban areas that is forming around protected areas and indigenous areas. This is defining the future of the region. And we barely talk about it when we talk about conservation or when we talk about indigenous areas. This brings a lot of new challenges, particularly on the environmental side, but it also brings opportunities, such as much shorter supply chains or the possibility for local communities to have markets, in cities and to find other options, economic options. But we cannot, sort of bypass this discussion of the complexity of the urban networks that are emerging in this and other regions. The value aggregation thing. I've been working with acai agroforest producers for 35 years, before it was globalized. And I've seen that what we have today is one of the most, if not the most, successful case of a production system that is sustainable and inclusive is the agroforestry systems that came from the hands of local riverine producers, although they're not recognized as such. You have a lot of other people getting the credit today, right? So they are able, through their own response to the market, building upon their own knowledge and technology, to implement and intensify agroforestry systems in a way that today is spread throughout the region and has become perhaps one of the most important economic activities in the Amazon. It's a long story, but to say it briefly, the value of acai fruit, which brings incredible important economic income for communities everywhere in the region. But when you look at the aggregate acai economy, most of the value is aggregated very far away from the region and from the areas where these fruits are produced. Actually, it's aggregated proportionally to the distance that it takes from the areas where it's produced. So the benefits are captured elsewhere, right? We have a wonderful successful case of scaling up a production activity that now, it's inclusive and environmentally very beneficial, but the mismatch of economic gains is still there. The people who are producers are not benefiting the most. What are the initiatives that are emerging? All sorts of cooperative arrangements, all sorts of association arrangements, just focusing on producing a transformative economy at the local level, producing and aggregating value locally. That's one of the most important frontiers, I think, for supporting local initiatives on the ground, that you support the economy of transformation that allows people to benefit more and to generate employment locally. The other case that I want to illustrate briefly, which I've been working now for 2 years, is the community-based fisheries of the Arapaima, the largest fisheries in the Amazon. The Arapaima was at the risk of extinction just 20-some years ago, when community-based management started in a collaboration between fishers' knowledge and science knowledge. It led to the recovery of the Arapaima fisheries throughout the region, a huge success in terms of achieving in 20 years a level of organization that brought to the, from the extinction such important fisheries. So it's a great story. It's a great story, but it's not a perfect story. And those are the issues that I think we need, some of the problems that we need to think about today. The Arapuama case, I think, and that is an issue that I think applies more broadly to conservation finance in particular. It's a classic common pool resource dilemma, which depends on two factors: appropriation, how much do I take and how much do I leave for others, and provisioning, how much do I contribute to, how much effort do I put to keep that system going, sustainable. Any common pool resource depends on this balance of controlling appropriation and contributing to the management and to maintain the maintenance of that system. Now, what are some of the problems? Someone has to monitor it. You have to sell your fish, and you have a very low price. It has been almost, in some regions, the price hasn't changed for 15 years. But even though, it's a case that has been able to succeed and is today contributing widely to society as a whole in that region. So on the one hand, is a fish of change. It secures property rights for riverine communities, recover the fish, improve income, improve community infrastructure, service, and a huge level of organization. On the other hand, the participants, community members, have to put an enormous effort in monitoring those lakes, because the success of the community-based management create an attraction for a huge amount of illegal market. Now, monitoring and maintaining that success costs a lot. Costs money, costs time, costs family dedication, and no one pays for that. So you have this dilemma of an incredible system that communities dedicate an enormous amount of time to keep, but you have a very low price to compensate for that, even though communities have improved their income significantly. But we are all benefiting from it. What these figures show, which is an ongoing dissertation, and the dots there are the areas that are managed and monitored and secured by community members. And you have three kinds of monitoring in sort of vigilance, right? A direct, an effective, and a functional, sort of the area that you cover. The area covered, some communities will cover tens of thousands of hectares in which they are protecting through their own funds and their own efforts. So there's a balance here that creates a very fine equation for communities to keep and maintain a system, and at the same time to deal with the economic disincentives and other disincentives that are there. We do not have a mechanism to compensate the work that communities put in maintaining, conserving, and creating vigilance for the systems. We have mechanisms for areas that are undergoing fast degradation, but we do not have mechanisms for areas that are being conserved. And that's a huge issue that we need to deal with. Examples are emerging, and like the Collective of Pirarucu, a super regional organization that brings dozens of local organizations together, right, to solve common problems that are beyond each community level, particularly logistics, markets, and other technical issues. So it's a way, and that's emerging everywhere in the Amazon and other parts, are the super organizations that are sort of networking and bringing people together. So these examples, and I'm getting to the end here, I think they have a lot of practical implications for GEF. Most of those practical implications are already in reports to GEF. All the evaluations that I showed call attention to those issues one way or another. But there are important lessons here that I think we can take forward. But I want to conclude shifting a little bit the focus here. And placing this conversation within what I think is it's a broader issue that is affecting both indigenous people and local communities, and biodiversity and climate. And that has to do with food production. My argument here is that we need a broader frame for the contributions of indigenous people and local communities that is beyond the conservation aspect. And that frame, I think, intersects closely with issues of food production. And I'll try to justify why, as indigenous people, as I said in my first slide, have consolidated an image of respect for their contribution to biodiversity. At the same time, their contribution to food production has sort of become more and more invisible. And the conversation about food production or food security today is increasingly dominated by corporate actors. And indigenous people and local communities need to be really up in that conversation. Why is that important? Well, food production is at the intersection of both IPLC and the global economic and environmental agenda, right? The World Bank in 2021 released a report talking about the hidden cost of food production at 12 trillion. Besides the term hidden cost, because I don't think there's nothing hidden about the problems of food production, particularly for IPOC, right? But it shows the scale of the problem. So it's at the intersection of agendas for IPOC and for global environmental issues. It's closely linked, it's intrinsically linked to the contributions that they have to biodiversity, to conservation, to restoration, to climate change. In most cases, they are closely linked to food production, to some aspect of food production. It has an incredibly important role in securing food security at the local and regional levels. And a significant, if not most, of the pressures, of course you have mining and hydroelectric dams and other things, that IPOC are suffering have one way or another related to food production. Now, there's another aspect to that and another way to read or to think about who are IPOC and what's their place in the global food system of production. This is from a paper that I published just 2 weeks ago. And the gist of the paper is what the title says, right? We are set to lose about 120 million jobs in food production by 2030. This is our analysis based on current trends. We lost 200 million jobs in food production since 1990. So the trend is accelerating. At the same time, we have 1.2 billion people, the youth, coming to the workforce during this decade. That's the equation that we have. Who are these food producers and why it's relevant to IPLC? They are farmers of all kinds. They're fishers, pastoralists, forest managers, wild species management and harvesting. A lot of these categories are overlap very closely with the population of indigenous people and local communities. 866 million people are employed in food production, right? But among rural populations, 89%, 55% of indigenous people are employed in food production. Small-scale fisheries, many of which are done by LPLC, employ 110 million people, which is combined more than industrial fisheries, oil, gas, shipping, and tourism together. Pastoralists are 200 million. And if you account agro-pastoralists together, it will be about 500 million. Smallholders who are smaller than 2 hectares in their production areas, many of the IPLC that we're talking about, are 80% of the farmland globally and 35% of the global food production. It's a huge contribution. These are areas with less than 2 hectares. And if you look at wide space harvesting, there's a wonderful assessment for PBS, you're going to see similar contributions. What I'm saying here is that when we look at a projection like this, on the lost food production jobs during the next 8 years, and we see 120 million people moving from rural areas, moving from food production jobs to guess nowhere. We're talking a lot of it about IPLC. It's very hard to dissociate. So we have to confront the social problems that underlie their contributions to global environmental governance. And this is one major issue. We need to, and that's my point about reframing IPLC contribution, to foreground their contribution to food production. Because this is becoming less and less visible in those contributions. But it's one of the key sort of cornerstone of supporting IPLC on the ground, sustaining and improving the conditions of communities on the ground, and improving the drivers of change that we're facing. The problem with this equation, there's a much deeper problem that I think, is how we think about this trend. When I sent that article to Nature, I got 4 reviews that basically told me that this is inevitable. That's the trajectory of societal change, consistently. What does that mean? In what ways a world in which people converge to the most efficient production system, irrespective of who is left out, what kind of world is that? So if I read the underline of those reviews that say this is an inevitable transition of society, we're looking to a future without diversity. We're looking to a future of communality of urban people. Thank you so much. So there's a much deeper implication on how we think about those things. And that's why I think food production is very much at the intersection of this conversation. Although it has been left out, I think, for too long in the scope of talking about indigenous peoples and local communities. Because it represents a much deeper, I think, thinking about where we're going as a society, right? I mean, one explanation is economic. Yeah, it's inevitable, right? Efficiency will replace this sort of production on the ground. The other explanation is that this is happening because it's a product of ideas that we think society is transformed this way, and therefore, we accept that small-scale food production, indigenous food production, have no place in the modern world. But we forget to say that, it's part of a history of dying by 1,000 cuts, so to speak. You ignore rural areas, you ignore service, you ignore indigenous areas, you stigmatize local production system, and that itself turns into policy, turns in the way society thinks about those issues and accept a situation like this as just inevitable part of development, as people are disposable in this view of social transformation. So I want to end with this sort of issue, and go back to where I started at the beginning. I mean, we now recognize that we cannot move forward in global governance without a partnership and trust between all those involved. But that requires that we look into the problems that indigenous people and local communities are facing. You know, too often we romanticize and we look at the bright spots. We need to look under the hug, so to speak, to confront these problems and to really empower indigenous people and local communities to be the players that they are already in global environmental governance. I hope I didn't go for too long. Thank you.
Well, Eduardo promised to be provocative, and I think you've accomplished that. I think this is a wonderful setup for the two panels that follow. We are running behind, but are there any urgent questions that we can ask of Eduardo now? Otherwise, he will be here through the next panel and the break. But I think you have set up the conversation that we want to have on the Arctic and the Amazon quite well.
I hope.
Yeah. All right. No? All right. You are allowed to sit down for a few minutes. Okay. So now we are going to move to the Arctic panel, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the moderator, Monica Medina, who joined the Wildlife Conservation Society June 1 of 2023, and she's both president and CEO. But she also has a long and distinguished career in advancing conservation science and environmental policy on behalf of people and wildlife, and working at the highest levels of government, diplomacy, and nonprofits and academia. Most recently, she worked at the Department of State as the first U.S. diplomat designated to advocate for global biodiversity, and as the U.S. Assistant Secretary for Oceans and International Environment and Scientific Affairs. And she was quite pivotal to the 30 by 30 agreement, and also worked for the adoption of the historic UN agreement to protect marine biodiversity in international waters that we've been talking about, the BBNJ. So again, I'm not going to read her entire bio, but I would say that I met Monica when we both qualified as being youth, which was a very long time ago, and when we both worked for the US government, and she was working for the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. So she has a long and abiding interest and knowledge about this next topic on the Arctic and North. So I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator, Monica Medina.
Thanks so much, Rosina, and it's really an honor to be here and an honor to be part of this panel. I dare say I'm not qualified to really speak that much on this topic, but I can say from personal experience that I have been moved by my time in the Arctic, working on behalf of Arctic peoples, particularly in Alaska, for indigenous whale hunting rights at the International Whaling Commission, and that's where I learned firsthand the importance of this region in the world. So let me ask our panelists to come on up while I set the stage, and I'll introduce them in a minute. The Arctic environment is an extreme one, and it has unique challenges. It's overheating, but it's underappreciated and misunderstood. It has an abundance of natural resources, but a dearth of financial resources. It's about to be hugely overexploited, but it's underregulated and undergoverned. It's thought to be underpopulated, but actually the population of indigenous peoples in the Arctic is probably a very, very high percentage as compared to other parts of the world. And it's literally on fire, which most people don't know. The Arctic and the high north, we've all experienced the fires, but there are even zombie fires that last all winter long, lying under the ice. So it's really dramatically misunderstood. I'm also pleased to be part of an organization, WCS, that is working in the Arctic with indigenous partners. There are co-producers on projects here in Canada's far north on health, food security, and wildlife conservation. Let me give you a quick roadmap. I'm going to give each of these three wonderful speakers, who I'll introduce in a minute, an opportunity to speak, and then we'll have time for questions among the panel and from some of you. So let me introduce them. First, Judith Dohutsu, Ramos, who is the assistant professor at the University of Alaska Southeast, an expert in indigenous knowledge and natural resource management. Also, we have Jackie Kutulana Schaefer, who's the director of climate initiatives at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. And finally, Eli Enns, who's the CEO of the Isaac Olem Foundation and works on conservation through reconciliation partnerships, connecting communities from the Arctic to the Amazon. This is a wonderful group. Now I'm going to give each of them a chance to really dazzle you with their indigenous and other knowledge, and welcome each of them to the stage, or if you want to speak from the table, either way, whichever is easiest for you. Here is the clicker. I can do that, or you can.
Ganshish. So I wanted to introduce myself in two of my languages, but I first wanted to acknowledge that we are on the unceded and ancestral territories of, and I can't say this, but I'll say Musqueam, Squamish, and on whose land has been stewarded by them since the time immemorial. And I work and live on the traditional homelands of the Akwaan, on Tlingit Ani, past and present for my people. We're the most northern Gulf Coast, Northwest Coast people. So our territory ranges from what's called Copper River down to Latuya Bay. And so this is a photo of one of my 5 favorite beaches in my home territory. It's called the Ocean Cape, looking out towards the Pacific Ocean. And I push this button? Yes, the green one. All right, I'll learn how to use this. So I wanted to introduce myself first in my Eyak language. Dachutsu aduta dachutnu tlingit kalku Juneau, Alaska, Kashikwan Ayachat, Sian Chusha Aduta Shishusha Chinatla Aduta. So Eyak is not even an extinct language, it's a dormant language. We lost our last fluent speaker a long time ago. So we're actually learning Eyak from a guy in France. And so we just had a Eyak language culture camp, and so one of the things that I thought about was our land. A lot of our indigenous knowledge is embedded in our language and in place. So it was really awesome for me to be at our traditional homelands up there on the mouth of the Copper River. It's a very rich place. Rich in biodiversity. You might have heard of the Copper River salmon. We also, they have a shorebird festival, and currently we're working with the Eyak language nature conservatory to try and reclaim some of our traditional homelands. And Eyak people are not recognized by any government entity, or they're not recognized even as a tribal people, so it's very sad. So, my name is Dachutsu. I live in Juneau. I'm Kashkaquan clan. And my house is the owl, so I like the GEF logo, which has the owl right in the middle of it. And my mother is Chusha, and my grandmother was Jinatla. So, and I work at the university. My father's people are Coho Salmon clan from Dry Bay, and my grandfather's people are the Brown Bear clan from the Anclan River. So each of us clan territories have specific lands and territory that we belong to. So I really had a hard time when I was working on my PhD to kind of, conceptualize, what is indigenous knowledge, and I was very happy to find this explanation, which says it has 4 interlinked components. Creation stories is at the heart of it, the spiritual core, and explains the origins of the earth and its people. And around it is the code of ritual and behavior that governs people's relationship with the earth. So one of the stories is called the Salmon Boy story, And it's one of our stories about the little boy that turned into a salmon. He went down under the water to live with the salmon people. And from the salmon boy story, we learned the proper relationship of treating salmon. And it's sort of based on our reincarnation. If you treat the salmon right and you burn every part of its body, it'll be reincarnated and you can eat. They call it just the image of the salmon, and that is the basis of the salmon stories. So around this is our practices and seasonal patterns of resource utilization and management that have evolved as an expression of this relationship. So if you don't treat the salmon properly and you don't follow these code of rituals, you'll lose these resources. And that's not only salmon, but many other animals that we use for our resources. So this body of factual knowledge has accumulated in connection with these practices. So just the outer part of that knowledge is collected by scientists. So it's really, I thought, really important to understand where our indigenous knowledge comes from. So this is what I call our reverence, conservation, and ethics. So this reverence and respect that we show is in not only Tlingit, but the indigenous people towards animals and their environment supported our conservation and proper treatment of animals and the environment. So each First Nation has certain animals that talks about this animals as spiritual beings or as people, and also describes the proper relationship towards all these other species. So when I was trying to write my paper on the TEK of salmon, I went to write to Dr. De Laguna, who had worked many years, and she wrote me back this wonderful letter about resource management, and she said, "Please remember that you're trying to explain the native ways of thinking about territorial rights, fishing, and all the other topics on your list. Give up the jargon of resource management. That is the white man's way of thinking about such matters. You should see the Tlingit native people that they were living in the world with the plants and animals and fish. The natives have been part of the ecosystem for hundreds, thousands, like 10,000 years, and a balance has been achieved so there's no danger that they would take more fishing game and deplete their supplies. They believe that the animals permitted the humans to use their bodies provided they treated them with respect and were not wasteful. Before that time, the Indians had no chance or desire to catch more fish they needed because drying and preserving it was a long, difficult process." So anyway, so I say that, give up that jargon of resource management. So this is our territory along the whole North Gulf Coast of Alaska, starting at Copper River and going all the way down to Lituya Bay. In each of those four, what we call territories, belong to clans who were the resource managers of their resources. So if you wanted to go and harvest any species within their territories, you had to go to the clan and get permission from them to harvest their resources. So this was the traditional system up until the 1887 when we became part of the United States. And what happened was the US government was not happy with the Tlingits fighting for their rights, and they came and bombed 3 of our villages. And that also came along with the commodification of our resources with 50 canneries being allowed on our rivers, and they were allowed to go fishing for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and so totally depleted our salmon species. So that happened up until the 1960s when the whole salmon population crashed, and they blamed it on seals. So they took a bounty on seals, and they blamed it on eagles, and there's a bounty on eagles. But it was really the extraction of our resources that really caused the crash of the salmon in Alaska. So I just want to briefly mention the Yakutat Silcam project that I was involved in. So we work with the National Science Foundation, Smithsonian Institute to gather indigenous knowledge and also combine that with archaeology and glacier studies. And it dealt with the retreat of Hubbard Glacier from the mouth of the bay. And it was inspired my father, who knew from his uncles how to seal hunt and learned the names and location of the 9 sealant camps that are established as the glacier receded. And so we interviewed the elders and traditional knowledge of seal hunting, including traditional management of seal hunting. And it was really interesting because he had, specific names for different types of icebergs, and he knew about the currents and the wind and everything that affected the environment for seal hunting up there. And he had specific terms for all of these things. And he was the last speaker. There's 4 of the last speakers that were speaking our dialect that we interviewed for the project. So we don't really have any more fluent language speakers left. So this is part of us, and it was all documented using really high quality video and audio. And so we mapped all the place names and all the history and interviewed all the elders on this project. And it's going to be coming out as a Smithsonian documentation in November. So I wanted to thank everyone, and I also wanted to mention thanks to the Alaska Native Science Commission, and just briefly mention that they have on their website benefits and products for working with indigenous people. So they said some of the benefits is indigenous people could really observe if there are any really something weird anomalies or changes that may be happening in the local region or maybe ecosystem. And they also can identify emergent trends at their outset. They can assist in developing hypotheses for declining marine species through local observation and knowledge. Communities will be active participants and partners, ensuring the more supportive scientists and have the data for ground truthing to scientific data. It also will help researchers and students increase their observation skills in working with elders and engaging science in relevant to their communities. So these are just a few of the things that we do at the Alaska Native Science Commission. And these are just a few of the publications here, so I'm going to turn my time back over. Thank you.
Is everyone awake? Hello, Rickman, Ovanga Etika Catalina, Nalak Mechiska Jackie Schaefer, Inibainarunga, Anirunga Kikitagurumi, Salaktunga ANTHC. I am Jackie Catalina Schaefer. I am Inupiaq from Northwest Arctic, 30 miles above the Arctic Circle on the coast. Born and raised in a very traditional Inupiaq style lifestyle. Living off the land. I see some Samis in the room. We had reindeer when I was growing up as pets and as herds, but we always took the babies home. So I'm always happy to see a Sami because they're the ones that brought the reindeer over. I currently work as the Director of Climate Initiatives for the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. The Tribal Health Consortium, we have a very bold vision that Alaska Native people are the healthiest people in the world. We have the uniqueness of living off the land, air, and sea in our traditional ways. The Inupiaq in Northwest Arctic, I come from a family that has lived in the same geographic area on the planet for 500 generations. So we value that and we respect the land. We don't manage our resources. We are interconnected in a harmonious stance with nature. We honor the land. We honor our animals and brothers and sisters, and we dance in a harmonious dance with nature, stewarding the land so that they could gift us with their sustenance. So the diversity in Alaska, to me, is more important to show this image imposed over Europe. We have 11 distinct cultures, very different. We have 229 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and so that out of 526, most of those tribes are in Alaska, very small, isolated tribes. The consortium serves all 229 tribes. We have over 20 recognized languages in our state with over 200 dialects across the state. 32 ecological regions from frozen Arctic tundra to rainforest, where Judy's from, and 5 major climate zones. So it really is a vast area. We serve almost 190,000 Alaska Native and American Indian people across the state. So our people still live in this harmonious dance with nature. 50 to 80% of our rural communities get their food from the land, air, and sea. This is something that they've done for as long as they could remember. So it's done in a very holistic manner with nature, and we have a no waste policy. Regardless of the tools changing into Western tools, motorboats, snowmobiles, we still make sure that we respect and honor the sustenance that's gifted to us. So we make sure we use every part of the animal, every part of the fish. We don't overpick the berries, and every year they seem to come back 500 generations later. So how do we take indigenous knowledge and infuse it in design and engineering to create an evolution of people in the Arctic? We listen. We listen to the elders who have indigenous knowledge, which were called stories and storytelling by Westerners, but really it's an oral history, and it should be valued as such. Just because it wasn't written doesn't mean it isn't valuable. And so what we've been able to do is not only employ and train, educate indigenous people from across the state into our system, but they take that knowledge and then they infuse it with so it becomes a Western educational tool to add to their indigenous toolbox. And so those engineers go out, they listen to the community members face to face, they integrate those design ideas into engineering, and these are some of the components that we've been able to integrate into our systems. One of the elders in a community said that these Western systems are rigid and nature will always win. So if you put that stiff pipe on the tundra and it melts underneath, your pipe's gonna lose. And so we engineered this flexible Arctic box design so that as the house shifts on that flexible tundra, the adaptation of that pipe now is flexible so it doesn't damage the infrastructure. We still have over 3,000 communities that have never been served water and sanitation services. And so in order to meet their needs and provide a healthy way to live in the Arctic without water and sanitation services, we provide these in-home systems. Now we work directly with homeowners, so we get into the home and we look at the disparities and the inequitable response to our rural communities. So it's kind of twofold. As an Indigenous person, this isolation, most of those 200 communities are off the road system, so you have to fly there. There's a pro and con to that, right? Transportation is very expensive, so construction costs are very expensive. But what it has done is provided us access to our land, air, and sea traditional ways of living. And so that's the pro. So it's a unique way to look at our world, but sometimes Western ways aren't always the best ways. We have to recognize that these two worldviews could live side by side. We don't have to use everything the same. And we could evolve as human beings by learning and listening from our indigenous populations. In the Arctic, we had to prove that solar worked in the Arctic because nobody believed that we had enough sun. It's always dark there. Well, ironically, when the sun is out in the springtime, we still have ice and snow, the reflection off of that ice and snow multiplies the solar voltaics. So you get actually more energy from not only the sun, but the reflection off the ice and snow. So we've been able to use that to help with the ambient temperature, which is changing, and then with the water temperatures, with the ice gone, we have our winds are stronger, they're more unpredictable, but we now could capture the sun to help refreeze the ground below those homes and below the infrastructure. So we have, like I said, a very holistic view at the consortium to look at health effects on humans, on animals, because there is no disconnection. We have a network called the Local Environmental Observers Network, the LEO network. It is an international platform where we could have local people put on their phone photos or stories or events, climate events that are unusual. When we get these strong winds off the ocean, seabirds end up way in the interior, lost and displaced because of these unusual winds due to climate change. So being able to identify that, connect resources so that bird could go back to the ocean where it belongs, or to look at, through a One Health lens, disparities between or unusual health implications from plants, animals, and humans. We have lots of migratory birds that come up in the springtime, some as far away as New Zealand. Those birds could be bringing new disease, and then they could also be taking new disease back. So we have to monitor this in a very holistic manner, and using local observers is usually the best way to do it, because there are no data collecting models that are out there that could collect data 100% of the time. So humans are the best resource in this area. We have a report coming out here in the next few weeks, the Unmet Needs Report for Environmentally Threatened Alaska Native Villages. And these are just some of the things that are happening. Climate change is happening much faster in the Arctic, and the impacts are detrimental to our small communities. The response is we have to either mitigate in place, we have to so we're either hopscotching away from erosion or moving some of the community, or we protect in place, which would be like putting up a seawall, or we have to completely relocate communities. Now that causes all kinds of issues. When you relocate a community, you want to try to keep it, because we still live off the air, land, and sea, in that same geographic area, so you're not completely displacing the cultural component. That component is huge for our health indicators for indigenous populations there. Our connection to the land, to the food, to the sustenance is our spirituality. It is our physical sustenance that keeps us alive, and then it's our mental clarity. So when you get out there to do the hunting, to do the fishing, to do the berry picking, to gather the medicinal plants, you're interacting with nature on a level that is really lost in urban settings. So this is how we see at the consortium finding our way in this changing world, is really using indigenous knowledge as our foundation and inspiration to collaborate with federal partners, to educate them, and to find that space where science and indigenous knowledge are not competitive or side by side, that they could coexist and co-produce outcomes that will help us evolve into the future.
Thank you, Jackie. Now, Eli, your turn. Patient as you've been. Thank you very much.
Lovely to hear from both of you. Thank you so much. And yeah, acknowledging the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. The land that we call Vancouver today was once a very abundant place. I've heard from some of the elders about just how beautiful this place once was and the abundance of resources that were here, and want to acknowledge them. Yeah, so we have an initiative that we're working on here in Canada on the west coast. Well, I'm from Cloquet, Nuu-chah-nulth Nation on the west coast of Vancouver Island. My great-grandfather, actually, he was on sealing schooners up in your guys' territories many years ago. So we are all connected. And as Monica mentioned, we have the Issaquah-Lam Foundation, based here in Canada, which in and of itself is an innovation of ethical space, what we call ethical space, and want to acknowledge Dr. Reg Crowshoe and Danica Littlechild for bringing this idea to our work. And essentially, ethical space is where we create the space where two knowledge systems can interact with each other in an equitable way. You can apply this concept of ethical space to a variety of subject matters. In our work, we apply it to the realm of nature conservation, abundability. My elders, they don't like the word sustainability because we're not here just to sustain life. We're here to cultivate more abundance for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren to come. And as well as peace building and reconciliation and retributions and that kind of healing. And you know, I've heard stories from different parts of Canada and the world that, anyways, where we're from on the west coast of Vancouver Island, there's a story about first contact with European peoples, and had predicted all of this hard times that we are experiencing and the self-destruction and such. And that when we are on the brink of total self-destruction, that the great-grandchildren of the newcomers will come to our grandchildren and ask for help and guidance. And I see that happening a lot now. And so the Isak Olam Foundation itself is a fusion of two cultures. Nuchanoth, Isak is in a word in our language, it means respect, to observe, appreciate, and act accordingly. And olam comes from the Hebrew saying tikkun olam. The co-founder of the Isak Olam Foundation is Matana. Matana, another Monica Schmuckler, now goes by Shore, since they immigrated to Canada. Anyways, so Isak Olam is the fusion of those two things. Tikkun olam is to heal and improve the world. And so Isak Olam is our foundation. And we have a variety of initiatives, mainly focusing around knowledge mobilization and capacity development for Indigenous protected and conserved areas. IPCAs is the newest jurisdictional designation that in Canada, and it essentially is a modern day application of very old teachings about governance, governing ourselves and our relationship and the interconnection of all things. And so I'm very happy to be sharing the panel with the two of you, because you know we're looking to connect create a new era of solidarity among nations from Alaska along the Pacific Rim all the way down to South America. We call this initiative the Emerald Necklace of the Pacific, and it's connecting Indigenous-led conservation and you know, abundability or sustainable development initiatives all along the coast. And what had inspired me to start this was my uncle Moses Martin. In 1984, he declared the Mears Island Tribal Park. Wanajashilthus is the name of that place. And this was in the face of the machinery of Macmillan Bloedel, very lucrative industry in liquidating our forest resources. And so Moses, with the support of our Hutwayth, our hereditary chiefs, he declared Mears Island to be a tribal park and stood right in front of that machinery with dignity and with our teachings. And so 15, maybe 20 years ago, 12 years ago, something, we were having a conversation about Hishuk Ishtsawak, everything is one and everything is interconnected. And he was saying, you know, our salmon go out into international waters, and it's very insecure out there, not only from interception, industrial interception, but also deep sea pollution. And so there's a controversy on the coast about fish farming, and so this is what we were talking about. And I took that as a mandate. I took that as a mandate to work with nations along the coast and work together how to create a more secure Pacific Ocean. Because if we don't start doing something, you know, it's just going to be on to I have 7 children and I have 3 grandchildren, and who's going to be left holding the bag if we don't try and do something, is kind of the way I thought about it. And so we're getting there. We have the Pacific IPCA Innovation Center, and we're open to partnerships. We're strongest here in Canada, but Costa Rica is also a place where we have a lot of relationships and partnership with the Organization for Tropical Studies and the University for Peace outside of San Jose there. And so we're looking at, bringing IPCAs as a social innovation to Central America, and then bringing the Payment for Environmental Services program from Costa Rica to Canada. So we'll have a side event. My team's in the back over there. We have a side event tomorrow, and Anais did not answer my text message. What time is the session tomorrow? 3 to 4:30. We have a side event where we're going to be talking specifically about this knowledge exchange, and we've got stickers and such with the barcode. I never want to learn how to use a barcode. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so that's what we're working on, and one of my grandmothers, she said to me the first time I attended a meeting, she said, I don't know where this term First Nations comes from, or Indigenous, or Aboriginal, or Native, or Indian, all these words that have been placed upon us. She said, we're kuas, we're real live human beings. And built in, that concept has all kinds of teachings associated with it. And one of those is an inherent intergenerational accountability that, it's built right into our understanding of what it means to be human. So I'll just end on that, and thank you. Again, lovely to hear your work, and hopefully we get connected, exchange emails and stuff with the team and work together. Thank you. Kleko, kleko, choo.
Thank you, Eli, and thank you for explaining about your Tikkun Olam, Heal the World. I think that's a wonderful way to think about what we're all up to here. We now have time for questions, and I'm going to pose one while audience members think of and can approach the mic, or just raise your hand. It's a small enough room. We'll hear you. My question to each of you is, if you were the king or queen of the GEF for a day, and you had your hands on the resources or the might of the GEF, what would you do to help this part of kind of its work with Indigenous communities? How could the GEF best advance this work?
Well, I think one of the issues we have in Alaska is we don't have jurisdiction over sovereign lands, and we're rapidly losing Indigenous knowledge for many reasons. One is a major, rural urban migration because of the high cost of living in our villages. So just to try to advocate for, or having governance over our own traditional territories, encouraging Indigenous languages, and also, finding ways that we can innovate to help keep our youth in our own communities.
Wow. I would say my granddaughter said we were out fishing and we got a king salmon. And she said, but it has eggs, so it must be a queen. So if I were a queen for a day, I really think that we have to, one, acknowledge and value all the elements that were either deconstructed or taken away from the Indigenous populations across the globe. We're at a place where that knowledge is going to save humanity. But if we can't even fill the space with equitable seats, how are we going to do that? I listened to the youth panel, and there's such an inspiration. They were so well versed And I tried to imagine myself as a young girl in a village. I was pretty bold. I went off to Europe. But if I had the money today, I would say invest in the youth and invest in equitable space. We could talk about indigenous knowledge systems, but unless that knowledge comes from the indigenous people themselves, it's not truly indigenous knowledge systems. So I would say invest in the space and the youth.
Now I'm craving salmon eggs. Yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with money. I just think it's creates so much problem and greed and competition and unhealthiness. But I agree that, you know, investing in the young folks is very important. And the other thing that always goes through my head when we talk about money is that sometimes there's things we can start doing, but there's also things we should stop doing. You know, and so I think we need to have a hard look in the mirror about the things we should stop doing. The pandemic was an opportunity for us to reevaluate that. You know, my elders they told me that we're going to have more pandemics, and that's part of the reason why we do tribal parks, is to make sure the land can hold us in those times of need, safe haven. But anyways, yeah, things we should stop doing. And then the other thing I'll note too is, like, when we had no money, it was amazing what we accomplished, because people came together with their hearts, and they came together for the right reasons, not for a paycheck or whatever, you know. So most of my time doing this work, I've been poor, financially poor. But yeah, I think if I were king for the day, I'd say Jeff should invest in indigenous protected and conserved areas. I'm very biased about that, and the youth, and to, you know, get them really excited and make conservation of nature exciting. Not like tisk, you shouldn't drive, you know, like the shame stuff, but how can we move our energy in a good way? You know, so reimagining economy, like, well, I mean, repatriate or rematriate the word economy. It's Greek, by the way, from ecology, ecosystem, economy, and it's all about the wise and prudent management of the home. Okay, I'll stop.
That was incredible. I think there's so much there. I agree with you that I think there needs to be a global movement. We need to come together around this, and I think it would help young people to feel empowered if they could help us lead it, the way the climate movement has had its own sort of inspiration from young people, but now it's a global movement, so hopefully we can start here. Is there a question? Please.
Yeah, if that's okay. Yeah, thanks. I really appreciated all of your thoughts and ideas shared. So my name's Jennifer, and I'm a scientist, but I work very closely with the policy interface with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and I know myself and many of my colleagues in this room, you hear the message, how do we weave Western and Indigenous ways of knowing? But there is no pan-Indigenous approach, and many people are looking at, like, how do you do that, right? There is not one way, and I know many scholars like Danica Littlechild and many others are thinking about this, but I was just wondering if some of you could share your thoughts of, so as scientists, as policymakers, you know, we're with you, but are there places to go or things to think about on how to do that respectfully and how to do that in an ethical space, and just any ideas around that?
Well, the Alaska Native Science Commission has on their website developed some protocols for working with Indigenous people, and I think it's very practical, you know, advice. But just to think, you know, not to come with your narrow definition of what you want and for information, that we have a holistic worldview. So I think, you know, so it's kind of hard to kind of answer specific scientist questions because they're narrowly defined. And So just kind of take that and throw it away and start from our native point of view. But if you want to look at what we have, there's a lot of different protocols out there for working with Indigenous people that you can take a look at things.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you. There is no one way, so it depends on where you are. I'm a co-PI with the study of environmental Arctic change, where we have 3 teams: human well-being, which I co-PI with the scientists, and then we have our policy team, and then we have our Arctic environmental change team. So really looking in that space, one is just go do it. So I want to add to my ask, if I was queen for a day, to invest in action, actionable items that have solutions that are outcomes, so that we all leave feeling like we have a responsibility to implement. And so those spaces are being shared. Co-production of knowledge systems in different worldviews is something that, because of colonization, we've kind of been isolated and segregated. So we need to recognize that we share space now. I'm speaking English. I'm not just speaking my language, but there are barriers to that too. We heard a lady earlier that identified that. English is like taking over all the languages. So everywhere you go, it doesn't matter where you're on the planet, it's English speaking, and then they translate into whatever the local language is. So I think that science needs to recognize that, because science is a very Western-based system. And I look at my traditional, well, scientifically, they've dated us back 17,000 years. And if you look at 17,000 years and how long we've lived there and sustained that land, but now 150 years, and look at how much damage has been done. We have to recognize and acknowledge that without casting blame and shame, and really sit down together and say, as human beings, what do we want to see for the next 500 years? Not the next decade, not the next 50 years, but the next 500 generations. What do we want to see our planet evolve with us? So I really think that, yeah, there is room for that. But remember, co-production of knowledge systems is side by side. It's not writing a paper and then asking for Indigenous input. It is side by side.
It's my next favorite subject, science, after fish eggs. Yeah, science left to its own devices is extremely dangerous. Look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The science behind that, dropping nuclear bombs on civilian populations. And yeah, so unfortunately, science for the sake of just knowledge and exploration often then ends up in somebody's business model of how to make the most money as quickly as possible. I think the one thing scientists could do is they could design a spaceship for all of the richest people on the earth, and then find another Earth-like planet and take them there. Please. Even just pretend you know there's an Earth-like planet, you know? It's a movie, theme for a movie coming to theaters soon near you. Yeah, and I guess the one thing is, like, a lot of scientists that have approached me and my community, they're interested in traditional ecological knowledge about a particular plant or an animal or something like this. But I think that we have to start at the beginning, where there's actually biomimicry and social innovation. That's what ESOC is, you know, to observe, appreciate, and act accordingly. We don't need to cut that frog up into little pieces to understand it. You observe it and how it interacts in the environment. And if you observe and your parents and pass down that knowledge, and pretty soon someone is going to learn all about that frog and how it understands the world, how it perceives the world, and how it responds to stimulus in the environment. So yeah, biomimicry and social innovation. And another thing is, this will come from my Uncle Joe, is there's fuel within the tsunami inundation area in front. Somebody dreamt that up and turned it into a reality. And now we're just looking at a ticking time bomb down there. Seen it happen in the floods in Abbotsford. They're still cleaning up the mess from that. The people told them, the elders said, don't drain that lake. You know, science helped them to drain that lake. They use dikes and pumps and modern technology because there's sophisticated science to grow food in that lake bed all year round. And the elder said it's going to flood. Mother Nature's going to reclaim that lake, and it did in 2021. And my heart goes out to the people of Abbotsford and all the suffering, but that's the big punchline, is that if we violate natural law, we may never experience the consequences of that. It is our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren that will suffer, and that's what's happening today. Anyways, I yield back.
Wow. Well, it's hard to top that. We are at time, so I'll do the thing that moderators try and do and sum up what's been an incredibly eloquent and really thought-provoking set of remarks from these wonderful panelists. So please help me thank them. I think if I had to sum it up in 3 words, which is always hard, it would be values. Not just Indigenous knowledge, but Indigenous values. There's a lot there. Integrate and harmonize with nature, because that's how we can be most effective going forward. And I want to reiterate the thank you to the Musquam, Squamish, and the, no, I'm going to get it, thank you, peoples for their Indigenous knowledge and for their incredible commitment to conservation that leaves us a wonderful example. And finally, I want to thank some of the people who have made all of this possible. I want to thank Eileen Lee and Moore and other foundations for their support of the work that lots of us are doing to try to keep this Indigenous voice strong and powerful in the environmental movement. So thank you all. Rosina, I'll turn it over to you. So there's a great Amazon panel to come.